Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 51 of the Acts of the Apostles, and we're covering Acts chapter 26, verses 1 through 18. This one's called Blindness in Caesarea. By this time, Paul has appealed to be judged by Caesar, which is his right as a Roman citizen. But with that request, it means that Festus no longer can pass judgment, and neither can Agrippa. Regardless, Agrippa wanted to hear what Paul had to say, and Paul wanted to speak to Agrippa. Let's read our first passage today. Acts chapter 26, verses 1 through 11 says this. Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You are permitted to speak for yourself." So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. "I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews, especially because you are expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore I beg you to hear me patiently. My manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem, all the Jews know. They knew me from the first, if they were willing to testify, that according to the strictest sect of our religion I lived a Pharisee. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers. To this promise, our 12 tribes, earnestly serving God night and day, hope to attain. For this hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews. Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead? Indeed, I myself thought I must do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. This I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests. And when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them, and I punished them often in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme, and being exceedingly enraged against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. Agrippa may have been an expert on Jewish customs, but that does not mean that Agrippa followed the Jewish customs. But it is likely that Agrippa was aware of the Jewish beliefs, and along with those, the differences that existed between the Pharisees and Sadducees. Paul did not have the support of either of those groups, but as the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection, the statement that Paul brought up in his trials with the chief priests of the Sanhedrin, first Ananias and then Ishmael, summarized their case against him. Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. Someone came up with this witty way of remembering this doctrinal difference between Pharisees and Sadducees. Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, and that is why they are sad, you see. Pharisees taught that the righteous would be resurrected, and these beliefs were prevalent in the books of the prophets. For example, Daniel wrote this in Daniel 12:2, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt." The Sadducees did not believe in a literal interpretation of the Tanakh, but did believe in a literal interpretation of the Torah, just the first 5 books of the Bible. There are many people today, including some claiming to be Christians, who also disbelieve many aspects of the Bible. This includes a disbelief in God's creation, disbelief that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a virgin, and disbelief in the resurrection of Jesus. Honestly, these disbelievers who claim to be Christians are modern-day Sadducees. For each person, belief in God is a choice, and it takes more faith not to believe in God than it does to believe in God. But there are many who believe in a higher power that has no interaction in our lives. But for those who believe in God, to limit what he is capable of is incredibly small-minded. Imagine a God who created us and has the power to create life, but that power is limited by human logic. Those people don't really believe in God. Instead, they believe in a God who is a bigger, better one of us. But when we consider that this God created all that we can see and all that we cannot see, he would have to be huge. For me, the intricacy of the Bible explains God's plan so completely, so perfectly, that nothing else makes sense. Paul knew the Old Testament, perhaps better than all of his contemporaries, but was blinded from seeing how Jesus had fulfilled all those Old Testament prophecies. Paul was blinded until his Damascus Road meeting with Jesus, his conversion, when a light that was brighter than the sun blinded his physical sight. It is more than ironic that Paul went from spiritually blind to physically blind before God gave him spiritual sight and restored his physical sight. As we proceed today, it is all about blindness. Notice that Paul does not speak to Agrippa in hopes that Agrippa can have Paul released from prison. Instead, Paul is sharing the gospel with Agrippa. In this first passage, Paul explained the transformation that occurred in his life. Paul went from being the leading persecutor of the early Christians to being the leading missionary in the early church, spreading the gospel, all based on a meeting with the risen Christ. Notice that in his testimony to Agrippa, Paul acknowledged that he cast votes for these Christians to be put to death. That might confirm that Paul was not only a Pharisee, but a member of the Sanhedrin, as those on the council were the only ones with that ability to cast a vote of such importance. But Paul also shared this because of the irony and knowledge, that he had knowledge and experience with what occurred behind the scenes. Paul was aware that the Sanhedrin also had voted for Paul to be killed. Let's read the next passage. Acts chapter 26, verses 12 through 18 says this. While thus occupied, as I journeyed to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priests, at midday, O king, along the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we all had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So I said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness, both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you. I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles, to whom I now send you, to open your eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. What was Paul's purpose in sharing this with Agrippa? First of all, Agrippa was placed in the position of making a decision of whether or not he believed Paul. Paul's retelling of what had occurred on the Damascus Road was a pretty fantastic story, and certainly not something run-of-the-mill that happened to everyone. But what was apparent was the transformation that had occurred in the life of Paul after this event. Agrippa likely had heard of Paul before, and also had heard of Paul's diligence in persecuting Christians. How can this instantaneous change in Paul's life be explained otherwise? While Agrippa may be able to disbelieve Paul's account of what had occurred, what Agrippa must believe was at the very least Paul believed this had happened. Maybe Paul was deluded in that belief, but Paul believed that this had happened so strongly that his life changed as drastically as any life could. What should we notice in the words of Jesus? First of all, he spoke to Paul in the common language of the Jewish people, Aramaic, though Paul was also fluent in the common language of the world, Greek. The Jews were, after all, God's chosen people, and God sent his Son to the Jewish people first. The initial question by Jesus also is telling. Why are you persecuting me, Saul? Paul previously had not met Jesus, so how was Paul persecuting Jesus? This demonstrates the love that Jesus has for his followers and the connection that remains. When the followers of Jesus are persecuted, Jesus is persecuted. That makes perfect sense because that persecution is based on a hatred of Jesus, hatred of the teachings of Jesus, and those who hate Jesus are serving Satan. We tend to overlook that every single person alive on this earth since God's creation either serves Jesus or serves Satan. That includes those who don't believe in heaven or hell, don't believe in Jesus or Satan, and don't believe in any realm that does not include the present. Paul also wanted Agrippa to understand that Jesus explained the calling he had on Paul's life. Paul would minister to others and was to reveal this knowledge of what had occurred on the Damascus road, and in addition, Jesus would also reveal more to Paul down the road. Jesus would appear to Paul again. Paul was making sure that Agrippa understood that even this meeting between Agrippa and Paul was not a chance meeting, a mere coincidence, or even a one-time occurrence that Paul somehow had misunderstood. Instead, this was the initial calling that Jesus had made on the life of Paul. Paul began by describing his life before Jesus and continued by describing his life after Jesus. So Agrippa could witness the resulting transformation. Is that any different for any of us as believers? Why else would Jesus leave us here after he saves us? If it only was about our salvation, then the moment we were saved, he would take us to heaven. But instead, Jesus leaves us here as salt and light. Finally, Paul summarized his mission statement by saying this: I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles, to whom I now send you, to open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Jesus called Paul to witness to the Jewish people, and Paul certainly had a heart for those trapped in the same misconceptions and blindness that had once affected him. But Jesus also sent Paul to the Gentiles to open their eyes, to turn those eyes from darkness to light, and to turn their lives from the power of Satan to the power of God. It comes down to blindness. Blindness is not just not seeing. Instead, it is the inability to see. Understand the difference. When our eyes are closed, we don't see, but we can see if we open our eyes. But blindness means that we cannot see even when our eyes are open. Isaiah wrote this passage prophetically pointing forward to Jesus. Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 2 says, Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed, as when at first he lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan in Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined. Paul saw a great light on the Damascus road, a light so bright that it was much brighter than the noonday sun, high in the sky. Paul wanted Agrippa to see that light and receive the same forgiveness that Paul had received. Paul viewed himself as the chief of sinners, but standing in front of him was a man married to his sister. Even the Romans, who accepted almost anything, frowned on the incestuous relationship of Agrippa and Bernice. Paul was not there to save himself from whatever difficulties existed ahead in Rome. Instead, Paul was focused on saving others around him, the ones who faced certain death. Isn't that where all of us should be? Jesus pulled us out of the world, and once we are walking with him strongly, he sends us back into the world. Certainly, there's a time of growth that has to happen first. For example, if an alcoholic who has been saved for a week returns to the bar to witness to his friends a week later, it is more likely he will start drinking again, as he's not yet learned to walk with Jesus. But many Christians today send their children to Christian schools, only associate with other Christians, and remove themselves so far from the world that it is difficult to understand how they will have any effect on the world. God has us here to offer salvation, salt, and light to a world that follows Satan. We once were blind, but now we see, and we need to lead others to the light of the world, just as Paul did. At least give them the chance. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.